Live. All right. Welcome everybody to our May Lunch and Learn. My name is Kyle. I am the project coordinator here at Protect PT, and I am joined by Dr. John Stoltz of, recently of Duqesne University, recently retired, and he's going to be giving his critique on the recent the DEP radium and untreated landfill leachate investigation, and give some of his thoughts, and then we'll be following up at the end with any call to actions or links to follow up on as well. So with that, I'm going to just hand it over to John.
All right. Thank you very much, Kyle, and thanks for the invitation. I'm not done yet. I actually retire officially June 30th at the end of next month, and I will have emeritus status, so they won't kick me out of the university, but I will lose my lab and office space. So anyway, thanks for coming today. I just want to talk about a few things about this recent PA DEP radium report. A number of us who have been in this arena for quite a few years now anxiously awaited this report because of what reports had been done. And well, I'll start it off with just some old news. I mean, believe it or not, this is from a New York Times article back in December of 1990. Okay, that was my first year here at Duquesne. And it was about radiation danger found in oil fields across the nation. So these are conventional wells that were generating levels of radiation supposedly 5 to 30 times greater than the government allows to be released from nuclear power plants. But more to the point, disposing the waste in abandoned wells would cost $300 to $500 a barrel if it was done appropriately. So again, this has been an issue for many, many years. And here's a couple of other examples. I got to meet Stuart Smith. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. He had some serious health issues, but he was a lawyer from Louisiana, and his big thing was crude justice. And what he was investigating were people that were servicing pipes and found that the scale from the pipelines were radioactive. More recently, the story's been followed up by Justin Noble in an article back in 2020 in the Rolling Stone magazine, and followed that up with his book Petroleum 238 about the exposure to radioactivity through oil and gas in the gas field workers. Again, this is his article from 2020, and that's where I got to meet him, and we talked about things. In my own work, I've been trying to see what the connection is, because again, my concern for in my research has been on water quality, and especially drinking water sources, and protecting those resources, whether it's groundwater and private wells, or if it's surface water and public water. So again, we came up with this connection between energy and water, in which, as we know, with the new development, or for at least the last 20 years or so, that oil and gas is now developed, these plays are developed with a process called fracking, which involves high pressures and large volumes of water. The typical well now actually is fracked with about 30 million gallons of water, with the addition of chemicals and whatnot. But it generates a lot of waste. And where does it go? Well, it turns out in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio, West Virginia, that oil and gas waste can go to your landfill, your sanitary landfill, not a hazardous waste site, but a sanitary landfill. And the reason is because back in the 70s, there was a bill passed called RCRA, Resource Conservation and that basically defined oil and gas waste as non-hazardous. So again, we're following this up. Well, it turns out, well, those landfills that take this waste, actually, the waste, if they take a lot of it, can impact the liquids that are generated in any particular landfill, and that's called leachate. And then where is this leachate treated? Well, typically it goes off to a wastewater treatment plant. So again, what I'm trying to and what I'm concerned about is whether or not this stuff is eventually getting into our drinking water. And sure enough, back in 2019, I was able to get a sample of leachate from the Westmoreland landfill and saw that indeed it was impacted by, because they had taken so much oil and gas waste over the years, it had all the chemical characteristics of the produced water from these wells. More importantly, we noticed, and you can see I have my little arrow here, that it was also radioactive. So we really wanted to know, okay, is this, and back in 2014, the PA DEP actually did a study looking at waste streams from oil and gas, and they concluded that even though some of the liquids, especially the produced water, could have tens of thousands of picocuries of radium in it, it wasn't going to be a problem. So again, fast forward now, the first well was drilled in 2004 in Pennsylvania, the first Marcellus well. And it turns out Marcellus is actually one of the hotter shales in the country. Anyway, fast forward to 2023, and during COVID, my student Lauren Badicher started reviewing and did a thorough review of DEP records and oil and gas records to see just how well this waste was being tracked and whether or not, again, the idea that the leachate from the landfills was going to publicly owned wastewater treatment plants, which were quote unquote treating it, in reality just diluting it, and then discharging it into surface waters. And so the result of her study was that she found elevated sediment radionuclide concentrations downstream of facilities treating the leachate from landfills accepting oil and gas waste. Now, the numbers weren't, large, but the point is that if you continue to do this over time, those numbers will increase. Now, the other important thing is, if you look over here, how did we test for our radioactivity? Well, we basically used gamma spectroscopy, but didn't necessarily look directly at the radium-226 levels, but rather at some of the decay products. And I'll go into that in a little more detail, because that's one of the key things. You can detect radium-226 using gamma spectroscopy, but it's a little tricky. All right, so a little background here. I kind of jumped ahead now. What is radium-226? Well, it turns out it's a form of radium that is radioactive. There's also radium-228. A little physics here. There's three flavors of radioactivity. There's alpha, beta, and gamma emissions. Alpha, there's 2 protons and 2 neutrons, not to get too complicated, but it's a particle. And that particle can be stopped by paper. It's stopped by your skin. Problem is, if you inhale it, it'll decay in your lungs and lead to lung cancer. Beta particles are either positive or negatively charged particles, and they're a little more energetic and they can pass through skin. The last are gamma, which they're high energy, and they basically have to be blocked with things like concrete or lead. So you can have a particular radioactive element. So that's down here. So uranium-238, its principal radioactive emission is alpha. So it generates these alpha particles, but it also can generate gamma as well. Uranium-226 is both an alpha and a gamma. So again, you can have a single element generating different types of radiation. Again, a little more complicated. It turns out in the Marcellus Shale, for example, there's uranium and thorium. And these are two elements, I'm sure if you know anything about nuclear power plants and you've heard of uranium before and nuclear bombs and things like that. But so uranium comes in a variety of different isotopes as well, but it eventually decays. And what do we mean by that? Well, it loses its radioactivity. It doesn't like to be radioactive, and so it generates these emissions. And so each one of these things, so you see here, uranium-238, that's what this number is up here, decays to thorium-234 and generates an alpha emission. Then thorium-234 goes to polonium-234 and a beta emission, or protactinium. But you can see that there's a number of other elements that eventually the uranium will decay to, and each one of those has a different time. So what's the half-life of uranium-238? Well, believe it or not, it's 4.5 billion years. Which means that after 4.5 billion years, you go from having one down to a half. And then another 4.5 billion years, and you go from a half to a quarter. Okay, so you realize that it takes a long time for this stuff to decay. But anyway, if we look down here, your radium-226, well, that has a half-life of 1,600 years. And that decays to radon-222. And that's one of the things that is of great concern. If you're a homeowner, hopefully you've had your home tested for radon, but again, radon is an alpha emitter and is a primary cause of lung cancer. Not good. And then you've got your radon decays to polonium-218, which then can decay to lead-214, and etc. It generates a lot of these other, what we call daughters. So we have the parents, which in this case is uranium, and then we have our daughters, and in the case it's your radon and your radium and your polonium. So the reason why I put this one up is because this is the one that's relevant, the decay chain for radium-226. Another thing that we find in the Marcellus is radium-228, and radium-228 has a half-life of only 5.7 years, but it also decays to radon as well, but radon-220. But it also generates a number of radioactive elements in its own and through a different chain. So obviously we have all these little radioactive elements. Well, here's the interesting thing. So all this stuff is in the Marcellus Shale. All this stuff is in the produced water. And a study that was published back in 2014 that I had an opportunity to review and was very fascinating for me, they actually looked into the nature and the radioactivity in these produced waters coming from Marcellus Shale. And what their conclusion was, quote, previous reports that describe the radioactivity concentration in flowback, produced fluids, and other materials associated with unconventional drilling and hydraulic fracturing focused on one element, radium. Our projections suggest that in systems close to the release of gaseous radon, estimates based solely on radium-226 and 228 will underestimate the total activity present by a factor of greater than 5 within 15 days following extraction as radium decay products arise. So the whole point is that you seal up this stuff and 2 weeks later it's 5 times as hot. Why? Because of all the daughter products that build up. So again, that's part of the concern. Now, granted, radon is a gas, and if it's allowed to escape, then you more or less dilute it into a non-radioactive air, and your problem is solved. But we're talking about landfills here, and they're typically they're not necessarily sealed up, but obviously they're a lot less permeable. So what I'm showing you here is a recent map that Katie Jones from Frac Tracker Alliance did, showing all the landfills that we know of in Pennsylvania that are currently taking or have taken oil and gas waste. And you can see that there's quite a few. DEP says there's 29 out of the 49 in the state. So, and depending on where they are, they've taken more or less. So again, we're concerned. We want to know what's in the leachate. We want to know how much they've taken. Granted, once again, it all depends on how much other stuff is going into the landfill. But, you know, we have the DEP has a tendency to live by the old adage, you know, the solution to pollution is dilution. But the reality is that they really need to track this stuff. So anyway, so with that, back in 2021, Governor Wolf at the time, to allay the fears, or allay the fears rather, said that from thenceforth, 2021, that the landfills that were taking oil and gas waste would have to track their radioactive activity in their leachate. But and that was 2021. 2022 went by, 23, 24, and we didn't hear anything. And finally, through people like Jillian and Protect PT, and some reporters like Kyle Bentz from Inside Climate News wanted to know, where's this data? Where is it? And that's when we found out, oh no, the DEP is conducting their own 2-year study to assess the issue. And again, with bells and whistles back in March of this year, the report was released. And as we're seeing here, it says, report shows no radiation risk from leachate in Pennsylvania landfills. Wow, that's good news, right? So just to read some of it, the final report shows there's no significant risk to human health from radium in landfill leachate. The multi-year study of 49 landfills found that none had results that were over the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission standard of 600 picocuries per liter for discharge from industrial facilities. The study reinforces prior DEP studies finding that there is not a threat of radioactive material in water discharge from wastewater treatment plants facilities affecting surface waters or drinking water. So what's kind of interesting is they also look down further that they actually found apparently that all our landfills are radioactive because they found radium in all of them. So they couldn't even make a correlation between those taking or not taking because they all apparently had it. So where is it coming from? Well, according to this press release, the most common sources are medical waste, primary waste from cancer treatments, and oil and gas waste, which contains naturally occurring radioactive materials that are brought up to the surface. Then they also suggest that another source was radon gas, and is present in high concentrations in some parts of Pennsylvania due to unique geological formations. Well, this is true because it's coming from the shale. So already you can see I've got some highlights there. Well, guess what? If we look at what the study, and we're going to get into this shortly, there was no risk assessment done. It's never mentioned. The word risk is not mentioned in the entire report. And they used an NRC standard for that's Nuclear Regulatory Commission licensed facilities. Medical waste was never mentioned in the report. And again, and if it were due to radon, that would indicate failed liners, which is another thing that should be of great concern. So what were the documents that were released? There was the report itself, PA-DEP Radium and Untreated Landfill Leachate Investigation. It was 17 pages, 3 tables, and 3 figures. There were 5 appendices: A, General Methodology and Sampling and Analysis Plan; B, PACE Analytical Services Gamma Spectroscopy Results; C, Gel Laboratories Gamma Spectroscopy Results; D, Radiochemistry Laboratory Results; and E, Summarized Gamma Spectroscopy Results. So where the good stuff is, it's actually in Appendices B, because that's over 3,000 pages and it contains all the results from all the samples that they took. Now, be aware that a lot of those pages also have things like quality assurance, chain of custody, and other things. So it's not all 3,000 pages of results. In the first appendices, again, you have to figure out because they didn't want to identify the particular landfills in the study itself, they gave them numbers, an SAP ID. But you can see here, number 1 was Bradford County Landfill, number 2, Lycoming County Landfill. Now that's important, North Central Regional Office. That's where a lot of stuff in the Northern Tier is going on, Tioga, etc. We're interested in actually the Southwest regional, things like Alex Parish Landfill, Laurel Highland Landfill, Max Environmental Technologies. But again, what you're not seeing here is whether or not any of these actually took waste. Now that we've done in a separate study, as I mentioned before, so we kind of know which ones at least have been reporting to the DEP. So what were my concerns? Well, number one, the study was designed by industry groups. There was no independent scientific advisory board or review. Methods that were used were for finished drinking water and are inappropriate for raw samples. We also believe the inappropriate threshold was used, the NRC of 600 picocuries per liter for licensed nuclear facilities and not 60 picocuries per liter, which is for treated water from treatment centers that the EPA stands. And then, of course, there are inaccurate statements in the report and the press release. So, not to get into the weeds here, but this is the executive summary, okay? And I call your attention to these 3 bulleted points. None of the untreated leachate from the 49 landfills exceeded the very conservative 600 picocuries per liter annual average radium set by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. This limit applies to untreated wastewater from facilities NRC licenses to use radioactive material. Well, I would say these are landfills. They are not licensed to handle radioactive materials. Radium concentrations in an untreated leachate exceeded the US EPA's drinking water limits for combined radium-226 and radium-228 of 5 picocuries at less than a quarter of the landfills. Now, that's another interesting thing. So now where does this 5 picocuries come from? And we'll see that. And then lastly, and I've already talked about this, DEP found no correlation between radium levels above 5 picocuries per liter and the acceptance of oil and gas waste at the landfills. All right, so anyway. So let's talk about the methodology. So how did they measure the radium? Well, they used 3 different methods. The first one was gamma spectroscopy, which is what my colleague who does my rad work, Dan Bain at the University of Pittsburgh, uses, is gamma spectroscopy. And this is what you should use, but it all depends on how you do it. And the first thing you have to realize, and why it's not the greatest method, is because it turns out that radium-226, and this is actually the qualifier from the PACE reports themselves, the reported radium-226 were determined using a direct gamma emission at 186 kilovolts. Again, a little information shared by both radium-226 and naturally occurring uranium-235. The reported results were determined assuming the shared energy peak is attributable exclusively to 226. Okay, so again, there's limitations to direct measurements, but as I said, what we've used in our method, sorry about that, going back to here, we actually look at some of the daughter products. And so one of the ways in which you can use gamma spectroscopy is if you seal up your sample and let the daughter products build up over time, and we use a standard hold time of 21 days in a sealed vessel, that you can actually measure things like bismuth-214 and lead-214 that have different energies but are easier to measure and more accurate, and then back calculate to how much radium was there to begin with. And that's the way that it actually should be done. But they didn't do that. The second one they used, they said, oh, well, we know there's uncertainty in this, so we're going to use these other 2 methods. And they used 903 for radium-226, which is alpha spectroscopy. Now, you remember I talked about the 3 different types, alpha, beta, and gamma, so you need different machines for that. And in this case, the method requires precipitation of the radium out of solution with barium and lead sulfate. But it is a well-known fact that any barium in the sample to begin with is going to inhibit that process. The second one, and they called it Brooks and Blanchard, but it's based on the EPA method 904, is for radium-228. And in this case, they're looking at using beta spectroscopy, and it actually measures actinium-228. But once again, the method requires precipitation with barium and lead sulfate. Okay. So again, and each one of these methods, as you can see on the as defined here, have caveats. And again, they recommend, the EPA recommends using the in-growth method to measure additional daughter products so that it strengthens your analysis. More importantly, these methods are for finished drinking water, meaning you can drink it, meaning it doesn't have a lot of stuff in it. And of course, they are well aware that other things in a sample can cause problems with the precipitation step, especially in the 903 and the 904. And this was actually brought to light back in 2014 by the same group that did the in-growth study. But this one says matrix complications in the determination of radium levels in hydraulic fracturing flowback water from Marcellus Shale. Now, what that means is they basically looked at this stuff and said, okay, are these methods going to work? And the thing that blows my mind is the fact that if you look at any method that they used that involved barium sulfate precipitation, they got, and this is your recovery of radium-226, less than 1%. So where does that leave us? Okay, so let's take a look at some of the data from the report. And this is from that one of the appendices. But you can see here, this is that Bradford landfill, number 1. You notice that there were multiple samples taken, but the highest value was over 1,000. And this is another, there were more samples above the 600 picocurie threshold. So I counted 13 total from 9 different landfills. So let's go back to that original conclusion. They said that none of the samples were over the 600, and yet, indeed, there were, and more than one. And then they said, well, wait a minute, we used the 901 method for this, and we don't think it's accurate, so we're going to use these other methods, and not a single sample was over 5 picocuries. Or maybe there were a few of them. But again, any ones that were over 5, they couldn't correlate whether or not they had taken oil and gas waste. But of course, going from the hundreds of picocuries down to a few picocuries makes sense when you realize that your recovery of the radium through this precipitation, because of the stuff that's in the leachate itself, inhibits that process. It makes total sense that they've gone from hundreds down to a few picocuries per sample, because the methods don't work. So that's one of the things. So if we go back to my original, and I'm sorry if I'm going to flip back and forth, just to kind of summarize, the study was designed by industry groups, no independent scientific advisory board or review. The methods used for finished drinking water and are inappropriate for the raw samples. For example, what we found in the leachate from the Westmoreland landfill had over 4,000 milligrams per liter of barium. So we know that there's no way that you're going to be able to accurately use a precipitation method, either a 903 or 904 or similar, to get an accurate measurement. And of course, we're going back to the inaccurate statements in the report and, of course, the press release. So, and I failed to mention this, they did their collaboration with the Environmental Research and Education Foundation in cooperation with the Pennsylvania Waste Industries Association. So those are the people that actually designed the study. And one other thing I'll point out to you is, if you look here, that it got cut off, that's all right, is that when you look at the methods, the method section that's provided in there, and I'm being a wonky professor here, everything's done in the future tense. So they never even changed the tense of the report, so that everything is in future tense. Like, they're going to do this, they're going to do that, they're going to measure this. my point being is that the report itself was shoddily put together, and they needed to do, and if it had been scientifically reviewed, I think those reviewers would have caught that. Now, the radium is just the tip of the iceberg. And why I mention this and why our concern is because that leachate, as I said, is going to wastewater treatment plants. And those wastewater treatment plants are discharging their treated water into our surface waterways. And going back to the 2011, 2009, we knew that one of the things that are also in addition to the radium is bromide. And why is that a problem? Because bromide in the source water for our public drinking water facilities during chlorination produces what are known as trihalomethanes. So you can see here, bromide facilitates formation of brominated trihalomethanes, also known as THMs, which are cancer causing. And again, way back when, Marcellus wastewater shouldn't go to treatment plants. Mm-hmm. So what we're saying is now the industry has figured out a cheap way of getting rid of their solid and liquid waste by taking it to landfills, perfectly legal because of RCRA. But that it's winding up again in our wastewater treatment plants. And downstream, we have issues with trihalomethanes. And so at the end of the day, we're going to be paying for it in our drinking water. So again, I'm very disappointed, as you can probably tell, by the results of this study. It was shoddy at best, and they need to do better. Thank you. Oh, last thing. This was just published, not by my group, but by a group out of Columbia, South Carolina. Understudied and overlooked radiological, ecological, and biological risk pathways from oil and gas production. Mm-hmm. So hopefully the spotlight will continually be placed on the industry to make sure that their waste is being properly treated. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Yeah, I mean, that was a lot of great information there. You know, as we've talked about before, you know, this is well, let me pull up there we go. Thank you. This is a very technical situation, right? There's a lot of background to understand before you get into it, before you can even start understanding what the actual issue is. But, you know, just as a layman, something that I took from this is it's hard to trust those that, you know, give us these reports, et cetera. And I'm glad that we have, you know, Protect PTs around. I'm glad that you're around for us to be able to do this work and figure things out. If you are interested in more information, you can always go to protectpt.org. We have all kinds of information there on the work we're doing with data centers and oil, gas, trying in our watchdogging around holding operators accountable. And our next Lunch and Learn will be next month with Lisa Graves Marcusi. She will be discussing how to handle yourself in local committee meetings as well as how to navigate local politics. So thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye. All right, and we are done.
So were there any